A poor single father bought an abandoned island for $500. Everyone laughed until he dug up something that shocked them all. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The harbor was wrapped in a cold, damp haze when Thomas Gray folded the newspaper and stared at the little advertisement for the 15th time. His coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. The line of text was wedged between job listings and old car sales, yet something about its simplicity held him. For sale, small island in Silver Bay. Former Morrison property. No utilities. $500. That was all. $500 for an island. He rubbed his eyes, trying to recall when he had last even touched that much money at once. Probably not since before Mary died. The years after her passing had blurred into a gray repetition of bills, broken tools, and long days on the shipyard. When the layoffs came, they cut him loose without a handshake. Now he and his 11-year-old son, Sam, lived in a rented trailer behind the port warehouse, surrounded by oil drums and the echo of departing freight trains. Each night he listened to the waves breaking against the wharf and wondered if life had already chosen to leave him behind. That morning, the wind pushed the fog through the narrow alleys of the harbor district. Thomas walked into Murphy's Diner, the only place still serving cheap eggs and burnt coffee. The regulars were there, the same men who had once worked beside him, their faces carved with salt and fatigue. When they saw the classified page in his hand, they grinned. An island? Murphy himself laughed from behind the counter. You can't even pay for your tab, Tom. Thomas didn't look up. It says $500. Murphy shook his head. And worth every penny. You'll get a few seagulls, a pile of rocks, maybe a ghost crab or two. You planning to retire there? Someone at the back shouted, maybe he'll crown himself king of nowhere. The laughter was easy, practiced, the laughter of men who had lost hope long ago and feared anyone still looking for it. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe, he said, folding the paper, but even a king of nowhere's got a roof over his head. That afternoon, he sold his old pickup for barely $600. The buyer didn't even haggle. He could see the desperation in Thomas's eyes. With that and the last of his savings, he walked into the county office. The clerk, a thin man with half-moon glasses, looked at him as if he were signing away his sanity. You do realize, Mr. Gray, there's no infrastructure, no water lines, no power. The last owner abandoned it in '74. I'll manage, Thomas replied. Storm season floods half of it. Then I'll build higher. The clerk hesitated, stamped the document, and slid it across the counter. Well, it's yours now. God help you. By evening, Thomas stood on the pier with Sam, the deed folded inside his jacket. The boy squinted at the misty outline in the distance. That's it? That's our island? That's home, Thomas said. The little fishing boat they borrowed from an old friend coughed and sputtered as it crossed the bay. The water smelled of salt and rust. The island emerged slowly from the fog, a lopsided shape of rock, tangled shrubs, and one sagging wooden house at the edge of a cliff. Seagulls circled lazily overhead. When they docked, the pier moaned under their weight. The boards were warped and slippery, barnacles clinging like scars. The house stood crooked, its windows hollow, roof half collapsed. A rusted mailbox hung by a single nail, the name Morrison barely visible through the salt crust. Sam clutched his father's sleeve. It's falling apart. Thomas smiled, though his chest felt tight. Then we'll put it back together. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke. The floors groaned with every step. A broken photograph lay face down on a shelf. When Thomas lifted it, he saw a man in a fisherman's coat standing beside a woman and two children. The corner was dated 1943. They spent the first night on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in their coats. The wind whistled through cracks in the walls and the sea's rhythm echoed in the distance. Sam couldn't sleep. Dad, he whispered, what if there's nothing here? No food, no power, nothing to fix. Thomas stared at the dark ceiling. Then we'll make something. You can build anything if you start with belief. In the morning, the sun tore through the fog, revealing what they had truly bought. Half the island was tangled with wild grass and sand pines. The soil was poor, but near the northern ridge lay a small patch of flat land, perfect for a garden. The beach curved into a natural inlet where boats could anchor, and though the house leaned like a drunk sailor, its frame was sturdy. Thomas took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sharp scent of salt and pine. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Here there were no bills, no pity, no eyes judging him. Just work, raw and endless, the kind he understood best. They started with the roof. Every nail was a fight, every beam a test. Sam fetched driftwood while Thomas hammered until his hands bled. At noon they ate cold beans from a tin, sitting on the steps that faced the sea. When the first storm came, the wind ripped half their tarps away. The walls shook. They spent the night holding the door shut against the gusts, water pouring through the chimney. In the morning the floor was flooded, but the house still stood. Back in town, word spread quickly. "Gray's gone mad," people said. "Bought a pile of mud for $500. At the diner, Murphy showed tourists the newspaper clipping and shook his head. "He's building dreams out of splinters." Thomas ignored them. Each trip to the mainland he bought nails, rope, and cheap tools, and each time someone had a joke ready. "How's your kingdom, Tom? The tide pay its taxes yet?" He smiled politely, loaded his supplies, and rode back. Weeks passed. The island began to change under his hands. The roof no longer leaked, the chimney drew smoke again. The garden sprouted timid green shoots. At night he would sit with Sam by the fire, marking their progress in a small notebook. Roof half done, door needs hinges, hope holding steady. One evening, as the sun fell behind the horizon, painting the sea in gold, Sam asked, "Do you think Mom would have liked it here?" Thomas looked at the waves for a long time before answering. "She would have loved that we're trying." By late summer, the island started to feel less like exile and more like belonging. The seagulls no longer startled Sam. He named a few of them. Thomas found an old sign washed up on shore, painted with the faded words, "Silver Rest." He fixed it above the doorway. The name felt right. Still, at night, when the wind grew cold and the moon hung low, he sometimes thought about the laughter in the diner, the echo of disbelief that followed him here. But every morning he rose with the sun and went back to work, the sound of hammering drowning out the doubts. One morning, while digging near the old storage shed, he noticed a patch of earth that sounded hollow beneath the shovel. He paused, brushed away the dirt, and saw a glimpse of rusted metal. The outline looked like a hatch ring, bolted to the ground. He frowned, tapping it lightly. The sound echoed strangely beneath his feet. He called for Sam, but then hesitated. The boy was inside, still asleep. Whatever was down there could wait. He covered it with sand and made a note to return later, after the roof was done. There was always another task, another board to fix, another day to survive. That night, as the waves beat against the shore and the wind rattled the windows, Thomas lay awake, thinking not of mystery or treasure, but of how far they had come. From a rented trailer to an island of their own, from mockery to quiet work. He smiled to himself, listening to the sea whisper against the rocks. Somewhere in the dark beneath the house, something hollow weighted old wood, maybe, or a forgotten cellar. But Thomas didn't know that yet. All he knew was that for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a wall. It felt like an open shore, ready to be built upon. And as the morning light crept across the floorboards, he rose again to meet it, his hands blistered, his heart stubborn, his island alive. The laughter from the harbor was already fading into memory. Here, surrounded by salt and wind, he had begun not just to rebuild a house, but to rebuild himself. The first winter on the island settled in like a long breath of iron. By November, the winds from the north had stripped the pines bare, and the roof patched and nailed with whatever Thomas could scavenge creaked under the weight of salt and rain. Yet the house, that frail wooden skeleton by the sea, remained standing. Every morning Thomas woke to the groan of the boards, to the sigh of the tide, and to the slow, deliberate sound of his own heartbeat. There were moments when he thought the island itself was breathing with him. Each day began the same. He stirred the ashes in the fireplace, coaxed a new flame, and listened to Sam's steady sleeping. The boy had changed since they arrived. He no longer flinched at every storm or complained about the food. His hands had calluses now, like his father's, and his face had begun to carry the stubborn calm of a child who had learned what endurance meant. Still, the hardships were relentless. They had no electricity, no running water, and no warmth except what fire they could make. The well had long dried up, so they gathered rainwater in barrels and boiled it for drinking. The garden they had planted before winter yielded only a few small potatoes and coarse herbs, but Thomas kept the soil turned, believing that persistence would teach the earth to respond. He made trips to the mainland once every 2 weeks. The journey was rough. The small boat rocked violently over the chop, but he grew used to the rhythm. In town, people still laughed. "How's your castle, King Gray?" One of the dock hands would call out. Another would shout, "You planning to charge tourists to see your wreck?" Thomas smiled in silence, bought what nails and oil he could afford, and rode back through the cold spray to his island. It was on one such trip that he found an old discarded stove behind the hardware store. The owner was going to scrap it, but Thomas offered a few dollars and hauled it home on his back like a treasure. It took 2 days to clean and repair, but when he lit the first fire inside its cast iron belly, warmth filled the kitchen for the first time since they had arrived. Sam had grinned, teeth flashing in the firelight, and said softly, "It feels like a real house now." The days lengthened, each marked by small victories. Thomas rebuilt the porch from driftwood and old pallets. He sealed the cracks in the windows with strips of canvas and wax. He found a broken radio on one of the abandoned boats near the coast and managed to make it hum faintly with life. On clear nights when they caught the faint voice of a distant broadcast, Sam would listen as if to proof that another world still existed beyond the horizon. But not all moments were triumphs. The storms of December tested the limits of their endurance. One night, as thunder rolled like artillery over the bay, the roof shingles tore loose again, and water began pouring through the attic. Thomas climbed up in the dark, rope tied around his waist, hammer in his teeth, fighting the wind. Sam held the lantern below, calling out directions through the roar. By dawn, they were soaked and trembling, but the roof was saved. When the storm finally passed, Thomas sat by the fire, his hands blistered and raw, and realized that the laughter of the mainland had lost its sting. The island was changing him. He began keeping notes in a battered ledger. Roof repaired, chimney functional, dock unstable, hope steady. Each line was a small defiance, proof that they were surviving where no one believed they could. Spring brought light, and with it, the scent of pine and saltgrass. The sea softened, the soil loosened, and green began to creep over the island's scars. Thomas planted beans, tomatoes, and more potatoes. Sam helped haul buckets of water from the rain barrels, his skinny arms straining under the weight. The boy had taken to exploring now, climbing the rocks, naming the gulls, finding shells and bits of sea glass he kept in a tin box under his bed. One afternoon, while clearing the northern side of the island, Thomas found what had once been a garden path, a row of flat stones buried beneath years of weeds. As he dug, he unearthed fragments of old life, rusted tools, a glass bottle half filled with sand, a porcelain cup marked Morrison & Co. The name struck something in him. He had seen it before, carved faintly on the mailbox and burned into one of the beams of the attic. Whoever the Morrisons were, they had left their ghosts not in superstition, but in work planks, nails, soil, stone. He took one of the artifacts, a wooden crate lid, with the family name, and hung it on the wall near the door. Sam noticed it that evening. "Who were they?" the boy asked. "People who built this place before us," Thomas said. "Maybe they gave up. Maybe they couldn't stay. But we will." By early summer, the island no longer looked abandoned. The roof shone with new tar, the porch stood straight, and the small garden had begun to sprout a faint promise of harvest. Thomas even built a makeshift dock extension using old barrels and driftwood. He painted a single word on the railing in thick white letters, "Home." The villagers, who used to mock him, now watched with quiet curiosity. On his trips to the market, they still whispered, but the tone had changed. Some offered help, a bag of cement here, an extra tool there. One old fisherman said, "You're making something of that place, Gray. Didn't think it was possible." Thomas thanked him without pride. He knew the work was far from done. The island still had corners untouched, secrets buried in its soil. There were old outbuildings half swallowed by ivy, a rusted generator, and that shed near the northern cliff, the one he hadn't yet had time to clear. He planned to tackle it soon, once the dock repairs were finished. Late one evening, after a long day of carpentry, he and Sam sat outside, watching the sunset spill across the water. The air was warm, full of the hum of insects and the distant cry of birds. Sam leaned against his father's shoulder. "It's beautiful here," he said. "Do you think we'll stay forever?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "If we can make it through another winter, maybe we already have." That night he dreamed of the mainland, of the mocking voices fading behind him. But in the dream they sounded small, almost drowned by the steady sound of waves. When he woke before dawn, the sky over Silver Bay was pale and clear, the horizon opening wide like a promise. He rose, stretched his aching arms, and went to fetch his tools. There was still the northern shed to clean, the old one with the concrete floor and the strange, uneven ground nearby. He could almost hear it calling in the morning wind, not with mystery, but with the quiet voice of unfinished work. He would see to it soon enough, he told himself. Just another task on a list that grew as steadily as his resolve. The island, once a joke whispered in taverns, was beginning to earn its silence. The brambles no longer seemed hostile. They framed the house like a crown. Thomas looked around at what they had built, the patched roof, the sturdy porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, and felt a calm pride settle in his chest. The sea murmured below, steady and endless. The laughter of others had carried him here, but now only the rhythm of the tide remained. What had begun as desperation was turning into something far greater, a home made not from wealth, but from persistence. And yet, beneath the hum of insects and the whisper of wind, the island still held its quiet, patient breath, waiting for the day Thomas would dig a little deeper and uncover the past that had slept under its soil for generations. By midsummer, the island had turned green again. The garden thrived, the beans climbed up the posts Thomas had built, and the smell of salt mixed with the sweetness of soil and pine. For the first time since moving there, Thomas allowed himself to feel something close to peace. He would wake before dawn, brew weak coffee on the stove, and step out to watch the horizon melt from purple to gold. Sam would still be asleep inside, his small frame wrapped in a blanket. The dog they had adopted from a fisherman's litter curled at his feet. It was a quiet rhythm, hard-earned and fragile, the kind that made a man forget, if only for a moment, the years that had been taken from him. The shed, near the northern cliff, had become the last untouched corner of the island. Each time Thomas passed it, he felt its silence pressing on him. It was older than the house. Its roof sagged like the spine of an old horse, its doors bound shut by vines and corrosion. One morning he decided it was time. He packed tools, a crowbar, a shovel, and told Sam to stay near the garden. "Just going to see what's in there," he said. "If it's safe, you can help later." The hinges screamed when he pried the door open. Inside was darkness and the smell of damp wood, earth, and iron. Light cut through the cracks, illuminating a forgotten world. Broken crates, rotted fishing nets, rusted tools, and old oil cans. Dust floated in slow spirals through the air, disturbed for the first time in decades. Thomas began clearing the floor, stacking debris outside in the sunlight. After an hour, his shovel hit something that didn't sound like dirt. It was a metallic clang, dull, hollow, unmistakable. He crouched, brushed away the earth, and saw the edge of a large rectangular plate. It was a slab of concrete, smoother than the rest of the foundation, with a pair of iron rings set into it. When he tugged at one, it refused to move. The ground around it had hardened like stone. Curiosity overcame fatigue. He fetched a hammer and began chipping at the edges, sweat stinging his eyes. By noon he had cleared enough to wedge the crowbar beneath the ring. The metal groaned, and a crack of stale air burst upward. Beneath the plate, the hollow sound returned, deeper this time, an echo that seemed to fall away into the ground. He paused. The idea of a hidden space under the shed both thrilled and unsettled him. It could be a storage pit, maybe an old septic vault, maybe something left from the war. The island had seen soldiers once. The Coast Guard had trained nearby in the 1940s. Whatever it was now his. By evening, he had pried the slab open enough to peer inside. A narrow stairway descended into darkness, the air cool and still. He fetched a lantern, lit it, and climbed down slowly. The steps were slick with age, and his boots echoed. At the bottom was a small chamber, barely larger than a pantry, its walls made of stone. Shelves lined one side, covered with thick layers of dust. On them rested wooden boxes sealed with pitch, their surfaces blackened but intact. Thomas knelt, brushing off the top of one. A faint name was carved into the lid, J. Morrison. He recognized it instantly. His hands trembled as he pried the lid open. Inside were bundles of papers, each tied with twine. The pages were yellowed but dry, protected by the resin seal. He opened one carefully and saw handwritten notes in elegant script. The ink faded but legible. They were dated between 1939 and 1945. At first he thought they were just letters, maybe family records. But as he read, realization struck. They were deeds, tax receipts, and maps official documents of property ownership. The Morrison family had held not only the island, but also a long stretch of the mainland coast, several acres where, according to one of the maps, a company pier now stood. Thomas carried the papers upstairs, his lantern flickering in the wind. On the porch, he spread them out across the table. Sam came running, eyes wide. "What is all that?" "Old records," Thomas said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Looks like the people who lived here before us owned more than this island." He traced a line on one of the maps with his finger. "See this part? That's the same coastline where the big shipping company built its docks. But this paper says it was never sold." Sam frowned. "So, does it still belong to them?" Thomas hesitated. "Maybe, or maybe to whoever owns what they left behind." He didn't say it aloud, but the thought pressed hard in his mind. By law, he had purchased the island and all assets connected to it. If these papers were legitimate, then he might have a claim to land worth more than he could imagine. The next morning, he locked the documents in a crate and took the boat to the mainland. He went straight to the small legal office above the hardware store, where he had once notarized the purchase. Inside, a young attorney named Anthony Miller sat behind a cluttered desk, his tie loosened and his expression weary from sorting through the day's paperwork. Thomas laid the bundle before him. "I need you to take a look at these," he said. Anthony adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages. "These are old." "Where did you get them?" "Found them sealed in a cellar under my shed. The name's Morrison, same family I bought the island from." Anthony read silently for several minutes, then looked up. "Mr. Gray, these appear to be original deeds and tax documents. If they're genuine, the Morrison family or their successor never relinquished ownership of a considerable strip of coastline." "You mean the one where Harbor Line built their piers?" Anthony nodded slowly. "Exactly that one." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Do you have any idea what this could mean?" Thomas shrugged. "I'm just trying to understand if what I bought came with any of it." Anthony hesitated, then said carefully, "Technically, if you acquired the property with its original documentation, and if no transfer or forfeiture was ever recorded, the rights might now rest with you." The words landed like stones in Thomas's chest. He wasn't a man of greed, but he felt the shift instantly. The laughter, the poverty, the years of struggle all seemed to blur into a single point of possibility. He could finally secure a future for his son, repair the house properly, maybe even build something lasting. Anthony promised to verify everything. "I'll need to check county archives, old registries, land use permits. Give me a few weeks." When Thomas returned to the island, the sky was red with sunset. He sat by the fire, staring at the crate that now held the papers. Sam was drawing by the table, the dog asleep at his feet. "What did the lawyer say?" the boy asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "He said we might own more than we thought." "Like rich?" He chuckled. "No, not rich, but maybe not poor forever." For days afterward, he worked with new energy. Each hammer strike felt sharper, each board heavier with meaning. Yet beneath that strength was unease. What if the company learned about the documents? What if someone tried to take them away? He began keeping the crate hidden beneath the floorboards at night, sealing the hatch each morning. Weeks passed before Anthony returned his call. His voice was firm, almost breathless. "Thomas, you were right. The records check out. The Morrison Estates coastal parcel was never legally transferred. Harbor Line built their facilities on land that's technically still private property, yours now, by inheritance through purchase." Thomas stood on the porch, staring at the sea as the words sank in. The waves rolled endlessly toward the shore, each one a silent echo of all the years people had dismissed him. Now beneath the humble roof he'd built with his hands lay the proof that fate for once had chosen to look his way. But he also knew this wouldn't be simple. Powerful companies didn't surrender land easily. There would be arguments, paperwork, lawyers, and threats. He wasn't ready for any of it. Yet as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the sea in firelight, he felt something that had been missing for a long time. Resolve, clean and sharp. He turned to his son, who was tossing stones into the tide. "Sam," he said, "we've got work ahead. Real work. The kind that decides what kind of men we're going to be." And as the boy smiled, unaware of the storm that waited beyond the horizon, Thomas looked once more toward the distant coastline, where the company's cranes glimmered under the fading light. Somewhere in those iron towers, men were making fortunes on land that wasn't theirs. For the first time, Thomas Gray understood that his fight wasn't just for a roof or a meal, it was for justice, and for the right to stand on ground he could truly call his own. The summer heat hung heavy over Silver Bay when the first letter arrived. It was printed on thick paper, the kind used by companies with lawyers, and bore the emblem of Harborline Logistics in the corner. Thomas found it tucked under a rock by the dock, sealed and untouched. He didn't need to open it to know what it was about. When he finally did, sitting at the rough kitchen table while Sam drew maps of the island nearby, the words were cold and precise. "Cease and desist from any claims to the mainland coastal area adjacent to your property. Harborline Logistics asserts lawful possession under public interest development. Failure to comply will result in legal action." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the crate with the Morrison papers. For a long time he said nothing. Sam looked up from his sketch pad. "Is it bad news?" Thomas forced a smile. "Nothing we can't handle." But his stomach had already tightened into a hard knot. The next day he rode to the mainland and went straight to Anthony's office. The young lawyer was already waiting with 2 folders stacked on his desk, his sleeves rolled up, his hair disheveled. "They've caught on," Anthony said before Thomas even sat down. "Someone in the county office must have mentioned my inquiry. Harborline's legal department called twice this morning." "What did they say?" "That you're trespassing on their development rights, which legally you're not. But they have money, and money buys time and fear." Thomas leaned back, rubbing his hands together. "What do?" "We prepare," Anthony said simply. "We gather everything, every document, every map, every letter, and we make a case before they bury us in paperwork." For weeks afterward, life on the island became a rhythm of anxiety and determination. Thomas worked during the day, repairing the dock, tending the garden, pretending that everything was normal. At night, after Sam fell asleep, he read through the Morrison documents again and again, tracing every line of ink like a prayer. Sometimes he would wake in the small hours of morning to the sound of waves and think he heard footsteps outside, though it was always just wind and gulls. Then one night, the fear became real. The sound of a motorboat broke through the quiet. Thomas stepped outside with a lantern. 2 men were standing on the dock, dark suits, city shoes, out of place in the salt air. One spoke with a measured politeness that barely covered his contempt. "Mr. Gray, we represent Harborline Logistics. We'd like to discuss an offer." Thomas's grip on the lantern tightened. "It's late for business. This won't take long." The man produced an envelope, heavy with cash. $20,000. "You sign a statement renouncing all claims, and we'll consider this resolved." Thomas stared at the envelope, then at the men's clean faces, their eyes calculating. He thought of the years of laughter, the nights of hunger, the long climb toward this fragile dignity. "I'm not selling what's mine," he said quietly. The man's smile faded. "Then you'll regret it." They left without another word, the boat's engine cutting through the dark like a blade. 2 nights later, a fire broke out by the pier. Thomas woke to the crackle of flames and the dog barking furiously. The small boat he used to reach the mainland was engulfed in orange light. He and Sam fought it with buckets, salt water sloshing over their arms until the blaze hissed out. The air smelled of smoke and burnt wood. Sam coughed, his face streaked with soot. "Why are they doing this?" "Because they're afraid," Thomas said. "And that means we're closer to the truth." He reported the incident to the local sheriff, but nothing came of it. No witnesses, no evidence, the deputy said, barely glancing at the charred remains of the boat. The townspeople turned away when Thomas passed through the harbor. The laughter had changed into whispers, pity mixed with fear. No one wanted trouble with a company that paid half the town's wages. Anthony, however, refused to back down. He filed an official complaint along with the property claim. The case moved slowly, bogged down in bureaucracy, but the foundation was solid. Harborline's lawyers filed counterclaims, accusing Thomas of fraud and falsification. The courtroom battles had not yet begun, but the war had already started in the newspapers. By autumn, the story reached the local press. Island man challenges, Harborline claims multi-million property rights. The article painted Thomas as both a fool and a folk hero. Strangers sent him letters of support, while others called him a scammer. Every trip to the mainland became a parade of stares. He stopped going to the diner. Even Murphy couldn't meet his eyes. The trial began in early November. The courthouse smelled of paper and dust, its wooden benches filled with spectators hungry for spectacle. Harborline arrived with a fleet of lawyers, each carrying a briefcase, each smiling as though they had already won. Thomas sat beside Anthony, wearing his only suit, a threadbare relic from his wedding. Sam waited outside with a family friend, too young to understand the stakes, but old enough to sense the weight pressing on his father's shoulders. The first days were brutal. Harborline's lead attorney questioned every document, suggesting forgery, accusing Thomas of conspiracy. They called witnesses from the county office to claim that the Morrison papers had no modern legal validity. But Anthony was prepared. He presented certified records from the state archives confirming the authenticity of the deeds, complete with original signatures and seals. The turning point came when Anthony produced a faded letter one Thomas hadn't noticed before, written by John Morrison himself, dated 1944, addressed to the county assessor. It declared explicitly that the land shall remain in private possession unless lawfully transferred. The letter's official stamp left the courtroom silent. When the judge asked Thomas to speak, he rose slowly, feeling every eye on him. "I'm not here to steal anything," he said, his voice steady. "I bought an island everyone laughed at. I fixed what was broken. Then I found out the ground I stand on was taken by people who thought no one would care. I'm not asking for riches. I'm asking for what's right." His words hung in the air. The opposing lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a gesture. The room seemed to shift, something intangible but real. The verdict came 2 weeks later. The judge ruled in favor of Thomas Gray, recognizing the Morrison deeds as valid and ordering Harborline Logistics to compensate him for unauthorized use of private property. The figure was staggering over $1 million. For a long moment after the ruling, Thomas couldn't move. Anthony squeezed his shoulder, whispering, "We did it." Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the cries of seagulls and the smell of rain. Reporters swarmed around, shouting questions. One asked, "Mr. Gray, what will you do with all that money?" Thomas looked past them, toward the faint glimmer of the sea beyond the buildings. "Build," he said simply. "That's all I've ever done." The headlines the next morning read, "Man wins against giant island owner, reclaims his shore." For some it was a victory of justice, for others a curiosity, a brief story to fill the paper. But for Thomas, it was more than that. It was the end of humiliation, the proof that integrity could still stand against power. When he returned to the island, Sam ran to meet him on the pier, eyes shining. "Did we win?" Thomas lifted him in his arms and smiled. "We did, son. We finally did." That night, the island was quiet again, the fire crackling in the hearth, the walls steady against the wind. Thomas sat by the window watching the moon drift over the waves. For years he had built his life from ruin, plank by plank, nail by nail. Now he had something he never expected to find: vindication, not for wealth but for worth. Outside, the tide rolled in, washing away the last traces of ash from the burnt dock. The sea, indifferent and eternal, whispered softly against the shore, as if reminding him that victory was only another kind of beginning. A year had passed since the verdict, yet some mornings Thomas still woke with the weight of disbelief pressing against his chest, as if the victory had been nothing more than a fevered dream. But the world around him had changed too much to deny it. The island no longer looked like a forsaken rock in the bay. The once tilted house stood upright, its new roof gleaming under the sun. The garden stretched across the gentle slope behind it, neat rows of green fed by the soil he had fought to tame. A narrow gravel path wound down to the dock, where his rebuilt boat bobbed softly against the tide. The air smelled of pine, salt, and sawdust, the scent of work done honestly. Every nail in the house, every board and window frame carried the story of what it had cost him to make this place stand again. Yet what had begun as a desperate escape had become something far greater, a symbol of defiance. People no longer mocked the name Thomas Gray. Instead, they spoke of him in the market, in the taverns, even in the city, with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Some called him lucky. Others called him stubborn. He preferred neither word. He had simply endured. Sam had grown taller. The boy's voice had changed, and his hands bore the same small scars his father's did. After the trial, Thomas had asked him what he wanted to do with the money. Sam's answer had been simple. I want to build things with you. And so they built. It started with a small workshop beside the garden, just big enough for a bench and tools. But soon other children from the mainland began coming on weekends, kids from the poorer neighborhoods, curious about the man who had beaten a corporation and rebuilt an island from ruin. Thomas taught them to cut wood, to measure, to repair broken hinges and frames. He called it the Harbor Workshop. There was no fee, no registration, just a rule. If you learned how to build something, you had to fix something for someone else before you left. The laughter that once mocked him now echoed as joy through the sound of saws and hammers. Sometimes in the evenings, he would stand outside and listen to it, that chorus of young voices mixing with the cry of gulls and the low hum of the sea. It reminded him of what he had really built, not wealth, but purpose. Anthony visited often. The young lawyer had become something of a local legend himself, though he hated the attention. One breezy afternoon, he arrived on a small boat, carrying a bottle of cheap wine and a grin that hadn't changed since the day they'd won. Thomas met him at the dock, and together they walked up to the porch, where Sam and a few of the workshop boys were sanding a table. You've turned this place into a proper kingdom, Anthony said, looking around. Thomas laughed. A kingdom without a throne. I prefer it that way. They sat on the steps as the sun began to lower over the bay. Anthony took a sip from his cup and nodded toward the house. You ever think of selling? This land's worth more than some whole towns now. Thomas smiled faintly. You know me better than that. I do, Anthony said, then reached into his bag. I brought you something. He handed Thomas a small wooden plaque. On it, neatly engraved, were the words Morrison, 1943. The old nameplate, restored and polished. Thomas ran his hand over the grain, feeling the past and present converge under his fingertips. Where did you find this? In your file box. Figured it deserved better than dust. Thomas nodded slowly. It does. He rose, took a hammer, and fixed the plaque above the workshop door. The letters caught the evening light, gleaming softly. The Morrisons built this place once, he said. We just carried it forward. The years of anger and fear had burned away, leaving only calm resolve. Harborline had tried once to appeal, but the case held firm. Eventually, they offered a quiet settlement to purchase the disputed coastal zone outright. Thomas accepted not for greed, but to end the war. He used part of the money to repair the bay's damaged shoreline, planting trees and clearing old debris left from the company's years of neglect. The rest went into the workshop, the garden, and the community. The townspeople who once laughed at him in the diner now came to his door to offer supplies or just conversation. Murphy himself visited one afternoon, his hat in his hands. You proved us all wrong, Tom, he said awkwardly. Thomas only shrugged. I wasn't trying to. They sat on the porch for an hour, talking about fishing, storms, and time two men no longer separated by pride. One morning, nearly a year to the day after the verdict, a journalist arrived to film a short documentary about the man who bought an island for $500. She asked questions about justice, destiny, and perseverance, but Thomas could see she was looking for a headline, not a truth. When she finally asked, "What do you feel now after all this?" He paused a long time before answering. "I feel grateful," he said, "not for the money or the land, for the chance to prove that a man isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he refuses to give up on." She smiled politely, perhaps disappointed by the simplicity of his answer, but when the piece aired weeks later, it was that line people remembered. Letters came from strangers across the country, farmers, veterans, single parents, thanking him for reminding them that not all fights are lost before they begin. That winter, the island grew quiet again. The wind howled around the corners of the house, but the walls no longer trembled. Sam spent his evenings by the fire, sketching plans for a new dock, stronger than the last. Thomas would sit beside him, carving small toys from driftwood to give to the children at the workshop. On one of those nights as snow fell softly outside, Sam looked up and asked, "Do you ever miss the old life?" Thomas smiled. "Sometimes, but then I remember what we have now, and I think maybe it all happened the only way it could." Spring returned slowly, bringing back color and noise. The workshop reopened, and the laughter returned with it. One morning, as the first group of children arrived from the mainland, Thomas stood by the gate and watched them run up the hill, their voices bright against the wind. For a moment he saw himself and Sam from that first day, two figures stepping onto the island, carrying everything they owned in a few bags and a stubborn hope. He felt the same pulse of uncertainty, but this time it was tempered by pride. In the afternoon, Anthony came by again, this time without the bottle. They walked together along the beach, the tide gentle and the air full of light. "You know," Anthony said, "they're still talking about you downtown. Some say you should go into politics." Thomas laughed. "I've had enough of fighting powerful men. I'd rather build something that lasts." They reached the end of the beach where the rocks curved into the sea. From there, the whole island was visible. The house, the garden, the workshop, all framed by the endless horizon. The sunlight caught the waves, scattering gold across the water. Anthony looked at him. "You really did it, Tom." Everyone laughed. "But you did it." Thomas nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "They laughed because they couldn't see what I saw. The thing about building something from nothing is that you stop caring about who believes you. The work itself becomes the proof." As evening fell, he returned to the porch where Sam and the children were finishing a birdhouse. The last rays of sun touched the plaque above the door, Morrison, 1943, and beneath it, in smaller letters, another plate Sam had added, Gray 2025. 2 names, 1 legacy. The sky turned crimson, the sea calm and infinite. The laughter of the children drifted across the bay, soft and unguarded. Thomas sat back in his chair, his hands rough and scarred, his heart steady. The world had mocked him once for buying an island no one wanted. Now, as the wind carried the scent of pine and salt, he realized that the island had never needed saving. It had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone who believed it still mattered. And as night fell, with the waves whispering against the shore, Thomas Gray understood the simple truth that had carried him through every storm, that the greatest treasures are not found beneath the ground, but built above it with faith, with labor, and with love. If you enjoyed this story, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. The next episode is already on the way, and trust me, you'll want to see what comes next. Check out the other stories on this channel, each one more unbelievable than the last. And before you go, share this video with someone who still believes that ordinary people can change everything.